A rant about front-end development. This is one that I've been sitting on for a bit. I've seen a couple people sharing this article, and I've wanted to read it for a while because I think I know a decent bit about front-end. A lot of y'all don't seem to know that my history is actually back-end, not front-end, and I'm relatively new to the front-end world still. I only started writing front-end code actively in 2018. Most of my career before then was doing crazy stuff in the back-end, and even after that point, I was still doing a lot of back-end things. So I think I'll have an interesting perspective here because yes, I'm a front-end leaning influencer, but I also have deep roots in back-end stuff. So my perspectives often find myself disagreeing with other people who have strong takes on front-end being great, but also the people who say front-end is all terrible. You should just be rendering HTML from the server. I'm somewhere between them. So I'm really excited to see how I feel about this.
We'll get back to whatever Theo's talking about in a second. First, we need to hear from today's sponsor, G2I. Before we go into them, we need to understand and accept two key truths about hiring right now. First, it is pretty difficult to hire great engineers. There's a lot of friction. There's a lot of issues trying to find them in the first place, much less hire them and get them at your company. And second, most recruiting agencies are garbage. You shouldn't need me to tell you that. We all get spammed with them every day. They have no idea what they're doing. They're not even technical. Not only is G2I technical, they are some of the most technical. This is the crew that runs React Miami, which is my favorite React conference, and it's not even close. The amount of fun I had there last year was unbelievable, and I will be there every year I possibly can in April, coming out if you're around. They do things very differently, though. They already have over 8,000 talented engineers ready to go. They have full interviews in video that you can go through to see these engineers, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and if they fit. And most importantly, they'll get them working in your code base in days, and you get a 7-day free trial with that engineer to see if they're a good fit or not. Unbelievable. No more bad hires, no more stress about bringing somebody in who's terrible, no more chaotic hiring processes and mess. You can just skip to the part where you get the good engineer, and if they're not a good fit, you just move on. Hassle-free. And this isn't just the US. I know people are concerned about that. They hire for the US, Latin America, and Europe. So if you're hiring today, you really should give G2I a shot. Check them out today at soydev.link/G2I and tell them Theo sent you.
A rant about front-end dev. Thank you, Frank Taylor, for writing this. I'm very excited to read it. I am a front-end developer who is fed up about front-end development. If you write front-end, this isn't about you personally. Okay, thank you. I'm writing a lot of front-end recently. I just redid the homepage for upload thing, and I'm working on a whole other project. It's like 95+% client-side code. So thankful. It's about how your choices make me angry. Okay. Interesting angle. Curious to see where this goes. Also, this is about how my choices have made me angry. So this is about their choices annoying them. But also, this is mostly just about choices. The technologies are incidental. I am thankful I'm recording this when I am because I just published a video that might end up being us agreeing. My do be late video, which super underperformed, but honestly kind of expected that with this one going in. I am proud as hell of this video. I think it's one of my best and most important ones because I don't think it's a good idea to be early to new technologies. The only reason you should be early to a new tech is because you really like that new tech and you want to take the risk of jumping on something early. But jumping on something early gives you no benefit and a ton of potential risk. I only started writing React in 2018, and I am one of the most prominent people in the React ecosystem. If your company is looking for experts to hire in React, I'm one of the people they might be talking to looking for those experts. And I got in halfway through React's current life. So it doesn't actually benefit you much being early. If anything, your brain's just going to be rotted by things that get changed, and then you won't like the changes and you can't embrace the new. So don't rush to be early to new things. It's okay to use a tech stack that's many years old. So I'm curious to see if we end up in a similar place as I read this. Note, the views expressed in here are not those of my employer. They are probably the views of thousands of people just like me. Maybe thousands more. Let us know in the comments if you end up agreeing with this article or not. Okay, it's full of profanity. That's fine. I'll insert my own. Ask your scrum master if 8 points of profanity is too much to handle today. Hey, psychotic. Anyways. Quoth the Raven on your merge requests. Nevermore. First, some background. I have neither a computer science degree nor an engineering degree, but I have worked in web technology since the second Bush administration. While we're exact opposites, I do have a CS degree, and I have an audio engineering degree, and I have only worked in web dev since 2018. This author has a very different experience. This will be very interesting to see how we agree and disagree. I've worked in a variety of roles, ranging from business analyst, tester, all the way through developer, consultant, and principal architect. Okay, In that sense, we're actually quite similar. I did agency work for 11 years before making the choice to work for a very large tech company. I have worked across sectors like insurance, healthcare, retail, banking, investing, marketing, and manufacturing. I have worked with global brands, which are household names. I have written a lot of front-end code for a lot of companies. I have also dealt with a lot of consequences created by the front-end code. My criticisms come from my role as a front-end developer and as someone affected by a front-end developer. I like how well they're qualifying themselves, saying what they are and they aren't, and what or how to take this, so to speak. I don't do this anywhere near enough. They're doing it a little too much, but it's honestly better to over-qualify than under in this sense, to make sure people know you're not trying to reach outside of your space. So I get accused of that a lot. Anyways, first point, no one gives a shit about content. I'll take an L. I think my content is worth giving a shit about. I like my content. That's why I made it. I gave a shit about content, and there was no good content, so I made my own. Okay, there was good content, but there was like blog posts and tutorials for beginners. And I made content because I wanted something more senior and more engaging and more fun. Let's see where this goes, though. Unless it's a content specialized front-end developer who works specifically in the content management space. Oh, this is for CMS stuff. Fun. God, if this is just a rant about the CMS bubble, I am fully with them. You might have noticed I never took a CMS sponsor, and that's not because they're not offering. I had a lot of options to take a CMS sponsor, and there's one I actually really like that I'm considering working with. But their angle is no longer CMS because they realized there's too many of those, they're cringe, they suck. Yeah, CMSs, content management systems, for those who don't know, are our attempt to unbundle WordPress so that it can be used in all these other web dev contexts. It's all a mess. There's way too many of them. None of them are particularly better than others. They were just rushing because they wanted to be part of the Jamstack bubble. So if this is about that, we're going to agree. Unless it's a content specialized front-end developer who's working specifically in the content management space and is specialized in writing front-end code for content management systems, CMSs. These are the only people who actually care about content. That's fair. Did you count how many times I had to write both front-end and content? Too fucking many. I have mentored quite a few bootcamp grads. There are exactly 0 grads from 0 bootcamps who have ever been told, users go to websites for content. 0. They all think it's their moral imperative to make sure every site is built in React. The crappy ones, sure. But I like to think most bootcamp grads know that they don't know everything, and they're just going to look at you confused when you say you're using something else. This is both assuming more of the bootcamp grads and less of them. Because I think most bootcamp grads, when you say that you're using Angular, their response is going to be, ew, every site should be React. Think that you're assuming too much because their response is going to be, what's Angular? But you're also assuming too little because you think that they will only acknowledge sites that use the tech they like. But the point that bootcamp grads only know React and they're scared of other things, that I can absolutely get behind. I've worked with exactly 0 computer science grads who have ever heard the phrase content before code. Unless the front-end dev has been forced by threat of not being able to pay rent to care about content, they don't fucking care. This is wild to me because HTML5 semantics exist, and their whole ass reason for existence is, in fact, having an understanding of content. You can't write content managed HTML if you don't understand the content. You can't write semantic HTML if you don't understand the content. You can't write SEO ready HTML without understanding the content. You can't write accessible HTML without understanding the content. Oof, that's a really fair point. I could rant about that for a while. And you can't write good HTML without understanding the content. I like this author already. For those who don't quite follow, content is the general word for the things on the page that aren't literally the HTML elements. So all of this content is probably in a div. All the things here are in a div that's in an article tag, that's in a p tag. None of that is the content. The content is the actual things inside here, like the pictures, like the post content, all of these types of things. Those are the content. And it doesn't matter how good you are at code if you don't deeply understand why a user's going to the site and what they are here for, your code's going to suck. If you have a great engineer that doesn't understand the product and a shitty engineer that does, I'll take the shitty engineer that understands the product every time because it's a lot easier to coach somebody through their shitty engineering practice than to try and make someone care about a product they don't care about. This is also why the best engineers at almost every company are the ones who actually care about and use the product. One of the most painful experiences I ever had as a dev was when I joined a team at Twitch that was working on a product called Twitch Studio. And I learned that despite having multiple people on the team who streamed, none of them used the product we were building, Twitch Studio, for streaming. They all used OBS. So they come to the day job, work on this app where they almost kind of looked down on the users and didn't care that much about how it worked because they were too busy using OBS. So they didn't care. It doesn't matter if Studio works or not because they're using OBS anyways. You don't understand the content if you don't at least explore the platform you're working on. And so so many devs just don't get it at all. Like, to go back to the bootcamp grad thing, if I had a bootcamp grad that streamed, spent a lot of time on Twitch, and deeply understood creators because they were a nerd about it, and I had a dev that might be way more experienced in writing code but doesn't care about the streaming world at all, I would take the bootcamp grad every time. So it's kind of weird having bootcamp grad be the starting point here if this is the focus, because I absolutely agree here. It's insane that people dedicate their lives to building complex applications without any understanding of the things going in between their divs. Like, that's crazy to me. Zero SPA devs that have ever met have ever given a shit about using a header instead of a section. I have found a fucks given about using a P over a div. The number of times I've seen numbers written inside of a list element instead of a UL, unordered list, instead of just using an OL, is deeply disturbing. Semantic HTML conveys meaning. Div class equals button. Like, divs have an on-click. Do you really need a button? Like, if I can on-click it, yeah. To be clear, that is a joke. You should use buttons for buttons, and you should use divs for things that are being divided and sectioned off. They're different things. Your HTML should be at least a bit semantic. Wrong input types is killer, especially on mobile. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Doesn't it catch that you've manually numbered a list? Oh, yeah, that you're putting the numbers in, even though the LI is going to number it for you. Yeah, that's a fair point. Somehow missed that. Ow. Next point. CSS is fine, you're the problem. Ooh boy. If someone gets a ticket for speeding, we don't blame the car or the road. We definitely blame the idiot who thought it would be a good idea to race the Dodge Charger camped out in the Dollar General parking lot. Fair. It's in this very same vein that we don't blame CSS. The problem with CSS is that the scope is global. The problem with CSS is the cascade. The problem with CSS is that it fails silently. Okay, I say all of these things and they're all true. Let's see what he has to say to me. These aren't problems, they're features. They are solutions to the very specific problem of how do we make content presentable as easily as possible with as little duplication as possible and with as few negative impacts to the user as possible. We have this, the actual history of CSS is more like, we have this format that was for printing things. Now that we're rendering it dynamically, we need the ability to make it look different. And also, we want the ability to change how it looks in different places. So we have this new standard that applies separately from the HTML so that you can apply different styles to the same HTML. That's the thing I think is being missed here. The way CSS was architected is so you could effectively swap out some CSS for other CSS back when pages were really simple. Now they're not that simple. Now our pages have individual elements that have their own expectations around style. The level of complexity of a button on Twitter is greater than the complexity of the entire web back when CSS was invented. So yeah, it has weaknesses. And I think a lot of the tailwind arguments explain these things really well. If your site has one or two styles like light mode and dark mode, speaking of which, weep nerds, weep. If you want dark mode, you should pay for it. Anyways, unless you have more complex things than a light mode and a dark mode, you probably have one style sheet applying for your whole product. As such, this separation between CSS and HTML doesn't necessarily benefit you and might come at a significant cost. That cost being maintenance. I've talked about this in so many of my videos. Go watch my Tailwind conspiracy video if you wanted me to deep dive on all of these things in detail. Anyways, let's see what the author has to say. Chances are, the thing you don't like about CSS are the things you haven't bothered to understand about it. Okay, just own me. Styles rarely, if ever, need to actually be scoped and encapsulated. In fact, the only time you want to prevent styles from being in the global scope is when you didn't write them and you can't control them. I think the next point is what I was about to say is duplicated class names. The fact that we've invented a whole new field in terminology around naming our CSS classes suggests that the industry disagrees here. Like BEM, when I first heard about it, I thought it was a meme. The idea that we have a methodology for naming our stuff in CSS. We have OO CSS, SMA CSS, Suit CSS, Atomic CSS, BEM, which is block element modifier. So an example class name like button -- state - success. This sucks. The fact that you have to effectively be an expert in a specific naming strategy to work around the global side is something that this isn't seemingly acknowledging. It might later on. But the problem that I have here is how hard naming things is. It's a joke that the two hardest problems in computer science are caching and naming things. In CSS, forcing us to name everything just makes life worse. I will also agree that scoping styles is a bit of a cope. The idea of using CSS, but your compiler locks in that specific style to that specific file by putting a bunch of prefixes on it. I know a bunch of things that do this, like Tailwind does this. I think Svelte does this. I'm almost certain that Vue does this too. Honestly, I don't care. I don't necessarily hate CSS being global, but I hate having to worry about global namespace. The fact that in a giant app like Twitch, I don't have an easy way to check how many classes there are in Twitch's CSS. I'm going to try though. Look at all the CSS files here. I'm going to just grab a few of these. So I'm going to do a real rough check here where I'm just going to do a search for new line dot. So that's not going to get everything. There are minimum 873 classes for Twitch. Minimum. Like actual minimum. Chances are there's actually quite a few more, especially because I only loaded one page and I'm not selecting things that are space dot. Another 680. Okay, so we're well over 1,000 unique classes, almost certainly for Twitch. That's insane. And chances are a lot of these aren't even being used anymore. Counting open braces actually should work. That's a good call. To be fair, this is just selectors, but we have at least 952 selectors. I wish there was an easy way for me to quickly filter to see how many unique classes there are here. But I promise you there isn't that much stuff being reused because it made life so much harder. According to the CSS overview, which is a really useful tool I did not know existed, there are over 1,300 elements, 13 external style sheets, 7 inline, 5,200 style rules, 4,351 class selectors. That's insane. Do you know how easy it is to accidentally reuse a class name? Yeah, we're also only on the home page. It gets worse on some of the other pages too. So the point I'm trying to make is that with a big enough code base, making sure your names are unique is an actual problem. And the fact that we've invented whole fields in order to do that should suggest how bad it is. It's really bad. Styles rarely, if ever, need to actually be scoped and encapsulated. In fact, the only time you want to prevent styles from being in the global scope is when you didn't write them and you can't control them. Do you know what styles you didn't write and can't control? The ones the other engineers at your company wrote. Yeah, that's my issue here. If duplicated class names are ruining your day, 15 class selectors are crapping in your cereal, and 8 importance are igniting turds in your garage, that's actually an architecture problem. I wanted to go into this with good faith, but this feels like you haven't worked in a big enough app. Okay, that's nice. All of Twitch's CSS only has 62 importance. That's nice, at least. One win. Are there real problems in CSS? Of course, but those problems are like border radius should have been called corner radius, and atomic stacking contexts are generated when using opacity, and an EM isn't really an EM. Those are problems. The CSS is not a problem. You're the problem. This feels like it's disagreeing with component architecture. The fact that I can mount a component in my component and it looks entirely different than it does somewhere else because something above is applying styles to it sucks. Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit of the small team thing here. This is like you have a 3 or 4 person front end team and then a massive backend team that you're building on top of, and you're trying to build your 3 or 4 person code base with tools built for 100+ people. I'm curious to see where this goes, because there were some points at the beginning I really liked. I want to see where this goes. Put on your big kid pants and develop a strategy. Pick some conventions, write them down, and enforce them through merge requests and peer reviews. This part is really important. Most best practices should be discovered and pushed through the code review process, and you should do things based on how they work in code review and what you learn there. This is a very good point. As for putting on your big kid pants, developing a strategy, and picking a convention, here's my convention. Tailwind. I did not think I would like Tailwind when I first saw it. I did not like Tailwind when I first tried it. And then I used it for 2 days, and then it clicked. And now I don't like writing CSS without it, because all of the things that we're talking about here are only problems if you let them be. And you have to worry about things like cascading or naming or selectors or any of this bullshit if you use Tailwind. It does just make life easier. I would highly recommend giving Tailwind an honest shot if you haven't and you're building front-end stuff, especially if you find CSS annoying, because Tailwind has actually made me like CSS more. Something I find myself doing a lot, even when I'm working in projects without Tailwind, is going to their docs to find examples. Like, I've regularly found myself in like a random blog or something that I'm working on that isn't using Tailwind. I want line clamp, and I can't remember the right way to do it. So I'll search line clamp on the Tailwind docs and just rip the CSS from here. I use the Tailwind docs more on projects where I don't have Tailwind because it's such a good reference of good CSS. So I absolutely think Tailwind is a valid strategy to work around these things. The point I'm trying to make is that putting on your big kid pants and developing a strategy and picking conventions, your decision could just be use Tailwind. That's a fine decision to make. But if you do need to make a decision, you need to pick a strategy for dealing with styles for your application. Server-side rendering does not mean rendered with JavaScript. Yeah, Laravel is an SSR framework, but yes, you do not need to be using JS to server-side render. That said, there are massive benefits to using the same code for the server-side rendering and the client-side rendering that we'll get to in a bit. There's a disconcerting number of front-end devs out there who act like it wasn't possible to generate HTML on a server prior to 2010. I'm not saying I disagree, specifically that a lot of devs seem to think SSR is just a thing that JavaScript does, but I haven't seen too many of them. In fact, I get the opposite a lot, where people will look at what I'm doing with and talking about with Next.js, and the response is, oh, so it's just like PHP again? Yeah, PHP had some good ideas. Having HTML that is meaningful come from your server and go to your client, that's a very good thing. It doesn't matter what language it came from. Having useful HTML is almost always a good thing on almost all applications. There are exceptions, like I mentioned this earlier on stream, my Dogecoin game, the HTML for this page is basically nothing because it doesn't need to be. If I actually go to the network tab and look at the HTML we get from the server, it basically just has a bunch of meta tags and nothing else, and then a script tag. Oh, I have this function embedded so that analytics don't get eaten by uBlock and other Chrome extensions like that. But other than that, it's just a bunch of data for SEO, and then a script tag to the actual JavaScript that runs it, my vendor bundle, my CSS, and then an empty root. If you see this, refresh and make sure JS is enabled. It's a game after all. Yeah. So the point being, there are some places where no SSR makes sense, but there's very, very few. Back to the article. They talk about SSR only in the context of Node and seem to have no clue that people started working on this problem when season 5 of Seinfeld was on air. I don't love this angle. Yeah. Understandable. CSS modules and Webpack at the scale that you guys are working at with the Twitch code base is fair. And I think moving to Tailwind on an existing code base is going to be miserable. And I am sure that the way that Twitch is bundling things might have made using Tailwind tough. Don't disagree with any of that. I'm falling down the Tailwind trap again. I can't keep doing this. I have enough videos about this. Anyways, back to SSR, because I have a lot of videos about that too, but I have different takes. So SSR, I think this dev is encountered too many recent bootcamp grads, because the history of this was the server rendered HTML, either because it had an HTML file or it generated one with something like PHP. But the original history is you went to a server that had an HTML file saved on it, and it would just send you that file. Then we started to dynamically generate them when requests happened, so different users could get different HTML when they went to a page. And then as we did more and more complex, unique things, we introduced Ajax, which meant that your website could make additional requests for more data after it loaded. And then as Ajax went further and further, and JavaScript, the language we used for it, went further and further, we started developing frameworks to actually control the UI. And then we got to the point where we were doing so much stuff in the JavaScript that we said, screw it. Let's send as little HTML as possible and let the JavaScript take over. That point might feel like it was recent. That was like 2014. It's been 10 years since that move happened. So if you got into programming after that point, you don't have the context from before. So if right now you're used to what we call SPAs, single page apps, that are JavaScript loading in a mostly empty HTML page and then taking over from there, the use of SSR to you and that term and the way it was introduced, the popularization of the term SSR came from frameworks like Gatsby and Next, letting you take this JavaScript code that you're used to running on the client and run that code on the server. It's a bit silly to say, but one way to think of SSR isn't necessarily that it stands for server-side rendering, but to many devs, in their head at least, it stands for server-side React. And yes, that's annoying, and there's a lot of devs who don't understand how much we used to do this. But there are just as many devs who love to flame me for saying, yeah, we've been doing that in PHP forever. You're not inventing anything new. I don't say otherwise. I agree. I think a lot of those patterns were great. And I would be surprised if you went through my comment section or went through my chat and had a lot of people who thought SSR was a JavaScript thing. I am curious, if I Google search server-side rendering, article from 2022, you know what? I'm going to do something a little more silly but useful. When and why was the term server-side rendering popularized? The term server-side rendering became popularized in the mid to late 2010s, primarily due to the rise of single-page applications and the need for better performance and SEO optimization. Yeah, we didn't say SSR in the time that he's talking about because everything was SSR. The term SSR only has meaning because there had to be something else. So before we had single page apps, we didn't use the term SSR because all HTML was server-side rendered. We might have used the term dynamic or static rendering, but we did not use the term SSR until single page apps existed. So while the concept of server-side rendering is not unique to JavaScript, I do actually think the terminology of server-side rendering was largely introduced and popularized due to the things that you're about to curse about. So yes, when we talk about SSR, it is often only in the context of Node because the term SSR has only been popularized since the mid to late 2010s. So yes, we started using the term for this. And according to Google Trends, the term started to take off around 2014. Thank you, Dan. Yeah. Hopefully this emphasizes my point here. They're using this term in the context that it's used in, which might not give them a big enough picture. And it would be nice if more bootcamp grads knew that server-side rendering could be done in other languages, but that is a term that has meaning, and the meaning is often for server rendering JavaScript. I agree that server-side rendering, the concept was not invented with Node, but the term was popularized due to JavaScript in the browser becoming so standard. What Node brought to the table was the convenience of writing your shitty div soup in the very same language that was invented in 10 days for the sole purpose of pissing off Java devs everywhere. Oh God, I was so excited to like this article. It's falling apart fast. Server-side rendering means it's rendered on the fucking server. You can do that with PHP, ASP, JSP, Ruby, Python, Perl, CGI, the hell, R. You can server-side render a page in Lua if you want. You can also client-side render a React app in Lua if you want, to be fair, but yeah. Just because Node isn't involved in generating HTML doesn't mean it's not possible to generate markup at request time. It is possible, it's been possible, and it will continue to be possible. Stop denying the history, contributions, and values that other technologies bring to solving this exact problem that is definitely not unique to you. Who is doing this? I agree with this point in particular. It is sad that we don't regularly enough reflect on the technologies that got us here. The importance of things like Ruby on Rails for normalizing the idea of a full stack framework. The importance of things like PHP for normalizing the idea of dynamic HTML that is generated on the server. A lot of these ideas are so important, and we should talk about them more. Yeah, I have opinions. JavaScript is not always the answer. Yeah, that's fair, but I'm curious what their point is. My brothers and sisters in Christ, I want you to know that I care about your souls enough to share these truths with you. You don't need JS to make a web page. You do need it for a web app, but you might not for a web page. You don't need JS to write styles. Yeah. You don't need JS to make an animation. Yeah. Especially with modern CSS animation stuff. That was not always the case, but that is now the case. Kind of funny you're saying, remember the past, and then you're saying you don't need JS for this when you absolutely did for a while. And you don't need JS just to show the content. In 2010, I was a contractor for an organization working with some very smart IBM consultants. They could not figure out how our in-house developer made the navigation for the site that they were implementing. It was because our developer used CSS. Our consultants had never considered that CSS could do something as fancy as show you a thing when you hover over it. That's a fun, har, silly, ignorant, smart consultant story, except at least it's about their harmless ignorance. You know what? I'm going to drop a real spicy take that I think will perfectly encapsulate why I don't agree with the premise of this article. I'm going to do that by showing an app I am working on right now. It's called pic.ping.gg. It is a tool for managing the silly faces I make for my thumbnails. You might notice here that when I hover over something, these buttons appear, and they're not there when I'm not hovering over it. How in the world did I ever make something that complex? I will be honest, before Tailwind, I might actually have done this with JavaScript, because setting a hover layer targeting a specific child, because these buttons appear when I hover over the element, not just this corner. So the way I handled that is pretty simple. I have the parent element, which is this div, and it has a group tag on it. Group is a really, really useful feature in Tailwind, where I'm basically saying, if I use a group tag lower, these are things that should apply based on something happening to this group. So if I use group-hover down here, since this is a child of this element, even if it's multiple layers deep, when this group is hovered, this group hover gets hit. So by default, this element is hidden, which is display none, but on hover, I change it to display flex. And that's not JavaScript doing that, that's CSS. Doing these things properly with CSS required a deep understanding of targeting, of subclasses, and annoying things that would have to be split across multiple files. And now when I'm reading this file, I would also have to have the CSS open to know, oh, this element isn't there unless this condition is hit. So the two things that Tailwind is actually excelling at here are, first off, I can see the behavior in the same place that the behavior and markup live. The fact that the things that this does and that the behaviors of these buttons, the fact that I have this download and copy image behavior bound to the button that's parent says when it's shown, that coalescing of concerns makes it so much easier to reason about, be it in code review, be it refactoring, being it almost any other scenario. Having these things encapsulated this way when they all are so related to each other is actually really, really valuable. And to skill issue myself quickly, the CSS I would have had to write, I could have figured it out and I would have been better at CSS. But I chose not to when I was writing these things before because CSS was intimidating enough that I would skip it. Tailwind, as a layer to best CSS practices, both let me do this the way you are proposing, which is through CSS instead of HTML and JavaScript, which is correct. If elements are dynamically shown or hidden based on behaviors that CSS can detect, you should be doing that in CSS. I absolutely agree. But I would not have if it wasn't for Tailwind. And it feels dishonest to me to not realize that your goals are being met through things like Tailwind, because I am a lot closer to you now in terms of how much I appreciate CSS as the right solution to these problems. But I would not have solved these problems with CSS before. And Group made this not even 2 lines of code, 2 miniature strings inside of existing lines of code. That's awesome. CSS made this really easy, but Tailwind made it easier for me to understand and apply it. And I'm sure you understood this already, but if I was to write this without Tailwind, I would be going to the Tailwind docs, looking to see how Group works, and then copying the behavior because it's a very useful pattern and I want to understand it and be able to apply it in other places. And Tailwind introduced it to me. Tailwind made this so much more possible for me to do right. I will also say here that bad consultants are very, very, very prevalent in the space. In my history, I've probably worked with 24 consultants or external firms, and of them, I have met one decent engineer and a bunch of people who are really efficient at wasting money and time. My introduction to the wonderfully cursed pattern of Redux Saga was through one of these awful firms from another country. So if your experience here is bootcamp grads in shitty engineering firms, we have a very different experience because I spent my time working with great engineers, hanging out with them in my chat, being part of this community. And I don't think anyone here has thought any of the things that you're describing. Specifically, I don't think any of us thought SSR only meant JavaScript. I don't think any of us thought that, okay, a lot of us think that CSS cascading is stupid and global scoping is wrong. It just is. Very few of us don't think about the actual thing we're building. I'm sure plenty sometimes do. But the idea that somebody in my community might not use a website because it's not written in React, no, that'll never happen. So it just might be a difference of the engineers we've worked with. But it seems like you're working with awful engineers. And I don't think limiting what tech they could choose would suddenly make them good engineers. That's a har, silly, ignorant, smart consultants story, except at least it's about their harmless ignorance. It's so much worse now that they know JavaScript. 5 years ago, I was on a project where the perfectly fine .NET MVC app was turned into an API for delivering content to a .NET Core app that used Node services to render Vue templates into fully rendered HTML, which meant that all of the templates were written in Vue, and we still had to write jQuery to make the content interactive. That's so cursed. This is actually terrifying. The idea of using Vue just for the templating and not using its interaction is terrifying. And I'm going to drop the really hot take of this is one of the things I like about React. React's templating language is JSX. You don't have to invent your own templating or use React's templating. You can just take JSX and use it elsewhere. In fact, there's a whole framework, Astro, that doesn't run or generate JavaScript. Astro runs on the server and it spits out an HTML page. If you want to include JavaScript, you do that yourself. And Astro tried inventing their own templating language originally. And since then, they've changed their mind. Here is some Astro syntax. All of this HTML here, that's JSX. That's using the same language and parsers that React uses because JSX is such a powerful templating language. But you don't have to use React to get the templating language. If you want to use Vue's templating language, you have to use Vue. And that's the issue I see happened here. Because if you had tried to do this with React, it would have been miserable and you would have just moved over to using JSX by itself. But I agree, the fact that devs were using Vue because they liked it, even though they were spitting out the HTML from Vue into their .NET app and then had to run a bunch of jQuery to actually make it interactive, I would fire every engineer responsible for that, straight up. Like, that's just incompetence. And I agree, incompetence sucks. And if these were my experiences, I would go mad. I recently came up with a term for this. I don't know if I said it on stream or not before. I call this the Alex Russell problem. If you don't know Alex Russell, his handle is slightly late. He has a really great blog and frequently noted, but he has some rough takes. He thinks React in and of itself is evil. He thinks websites are slow because of ignorant developers thinking React's a good idea. And the reason he has these biases is it's his job, originally as an engineer working on Chrome, but now as an engineer working on performance at Microsoft, to come in and help when something has hit the fan. If you spend all of your time exclusively looking at the worst of the worst, you're going to think really badly about the thing. If I have a circle, and this is all React apps, and let's say most of them are good. We'll do a nice split here. These apps are fine. They're not great, but they're fine. So this section is all fine apps. And then this section here is bad apps. If you spend all of your time living in this section, you're going to think React sucks. And if your job is something like a consultant that comes in to dig shit projects out of the shit mountain they've built for themselves, yeah, I agree, that sucks. And it's going to make you think really poorly of React. But the reality is, all the React apps that are doing just fine, you're not talking to those devs because they're doing just fine. Those devs are hanging out in my stream, hanging out in my chat, letting me know how useful the stack is to them and how much more productive they are, be it on individual projects or at massive companies. The thing about React is that it's so much more popular than anything you're used to. If we were to do this to scale, here is, change the text size, all PHP apps in the 2000s. And even if the ratio is way smaller, let's say it's a much smaller portion of these suck, which I promise you, thanks to WordPress, this is not the case. But even if we pretend WordPress didn't exist and we say that's the bad, and then this section here, this is the good, the point I'm trying to make is the sheer number of PHP apps in the 2000s fits in the margin for error of the bad React apps. So you might even have known every single bad PHP app back in the day if you were around back then. But if we're talking about things people actually use on the internet, the number of them back in the day relative to the number of them now, you worked in such a small bucket that it's easy to feel these biases. So the thing that I'm referring to here is the Alex Russell problem, is if your experience bubble is here, like these are the apps that you have experience in, you're going to think React is bad. But if your bubble is here, you're going to think React is a gift from the gods. Low Life Piano says, people who don't understand React are why I dislike HTMX so much. I feel like its biggest proponents don't understand what React is good at and for, and champion HTMX as the common sense solution to a problem they don't actually grasp. I hate that I mostly agree with this because I like HTMX a lot. I think HTMX is a fantastic solution because it lets your markup communicate a little bit more. I would say HTMX is to your Ajax behavior what Tailwind is to your cascading and your CSS. It makes it so HTML can do just a little bit more, so the need to reach for a more complex thing is much, much further pushed off. You shouldn't need React for your blog. You shouldn't need React for a comment section at the bottom of your blog. And you shouldn't feel like you have to adopt this huge framework for these tiny things. The issue that Lowlife described here that I largely agree with is that many people are jumping on the HTMX bandwagon, not because they have one of those rare sites or apps where they want a little more interaction, but not a lot more. I actually like what Ethan just said here. HTMX is infinitely better than writing vanilla.js or jQuery, and I think that's the comparison point. Absolutely. React is a massive solution to solving the complexity of interactions in a DOM. HTMX is a great solution for I have HTML, and I want parts of it to change without having to update the entire page with a new page. They're different solutions to different problems, but if you can look at HTMX and say, that solves all my problems, fuck React, then you're not working in a problem space big enough to notice. So that's also fine. But I would actually be really curious what this author thinks of HTMX, because I bet they would love it, and that would say a lot. Anyways, I don't want to HTMX tangent for too long. I already have a lot of videos. Check out my HTMX sucks video, by the way. Love that one. Anyways, also on this topic of like they're writing the templates in Vue. If they use HTMX and like any other templating, this would have been a fine stack. A .NET MVC that uses a decent templating solution in HTMX to update the client side, that would be a hell of a lot better than writing Vue templates and then jQuery. And I agree, this is a cursed stack, and if I had to work in this, I'd go insane too. Remember how this author, I just noticed this and I have to call it out. I think this author has some CSS skill issues. Notice that when I hover over text like that, I can't actually really read the text. The contrast levels are way too low. If I switch to from dark mode back to light mode, it's perfectly fine because this author clearly doesn't know CSS. He didn't bother changing the highlight color in dark mode, only has it set in light mode. So it's the same color and it's only readable in one of those scenarios. So I guess maybe writing your own CSS doesn't make everything better because it made the site less accessible. Now I can't select text in dark mode and expect people to be able to read what I have selected. Just saying, don't throw stones in glass houses or dark mode pages with that CSS, you know? I'm seeing architectures being proposed today that do pretty much the same thing I just described, but with Drupal on Apache, containerized Node, and web components. Who the fuck are you talking to? Who is actually proposing Drupal on Apache, containerizing Node, and then spitting it out as web components? Who the fuck? Can you introduce me to this person? I just, for the sake of it, I would love to sit down with that team and have the conversation. Is IBM building with fucking Drupal and Apache? I trust you, Agar. I hate it. If making peanut butter in a jelly sandwich by spreading the jelly on both sides of the bread is disturbing to you, good. You can still find God. I really hope God isn't web standards. I recently learned some fun things about Adobe CMS. Adobe bought Magento, which is a PHP framework for e-commerce sites, for $1.68 billion. That makes me sick. Hey, if you want to buy Create T3 app, we'll sell it for the low price of 200 mil. Cool. Yeah, that's way cheaper than this old PHP thing. Anyways, that hurts. That hurts. I've never talked to anybody who liked Magento, but Adobe bought them for a lot of money. Anyways. Do you have any idea how frustrating it is that in order to explain my sadness to my therapist, I must first explain like 5 different technologies, and by the time I'm finished, she's sad just hearing it? The session's over. I didn't even get to what was making me upset. Technology has made my anger a recursive function. Okay. If the author's going to skill issue me, I'm going to skill issue back. I'm at the point where I can explain web dev drama to my mom in under a minute. It's a skill. The same way CSS is a skill you have to refine by doing it, talking about tech drama to normies is a skill you have to refine by doing it. And if you're going to skill issue me, I'm going to skill issue you right back. Get better at talking to non-technical people. If you spend all of your time talking to engineers, specifically mostly bad engineers, yeah, I can see why you'd end up here. But talk more to non-devs. It'll make your life so much better in so many ways. Can we please stop adding complexity to our systems just so we can do it in JavaScript? If you can do it without JS, you probably should. Tools shouldn't add complexity. Chad make another great point. I started explaining tech stuff to my mom, helped me so much with dealing with clients and non-tech folks. Yep, it's a great skill. Getting good at explaining tech stuff to non-tech people will help you level up so much, because every tech person is also a non-tech person in something. When I'm talking about the kernel, I sound like I've never written code before. But if you can explain a kernel problem to me in a way that I can digest, like our good friend low-level learning, that's a massive skill. And if we're working on different sections at our company, I might not understand any of the stuff you're working on, but I might still have to sign off on your promotion. And if you were able to include me in a conversation that I am way underqualified for, because you're good enough at explaining what you do that someone who doesn't get it can understand, I am much more likely to give you that promotion. The people who make decisions around what you do know inherently less about the thing than you do. It has been very rare. I've had it happen once or twice in my career where I had a manager that understood the tech I was working on better than me. Most of the time, I knew my tech better. So I had to explain it in a way to my manager that I would keep my job, look like I was productive, get promotions, get raises, etc. Being able to explain things to people who don't get them is a skill. And if you had to waste a whole therapy appointment to try and explain the depths of these things because it was so hard to understand why you were upset, skill issue. I really wanted to like this article. I'm sad. I might have to write my own alternative because there are things I don't like about modern web dev and they're not aligned with this. Sass wasn't just a mistake, but a mistake factory. 10 years ago, I thought CSS preprocessors were the coolest thing ever, and I was incredibly fucking dumb for thinking that. The only good features that we got from CSS processors were the following: variables, mix-ins, and color transforms. Everything else was a mistake. Okay, so you think global CSS is fine, but you hate nesting? What size of code base are you working on? I'm so confused. Calc's a necessary evil due to CSS sucking. This is funny, because calc only exists because CSS sucks, and we need to do weird calculations because the defaults in CSS are shit. Yeah, this is where I think this author is going to lose everybody who was 50-50 on it. I don't know any CSS people that don't wish there was nesting. Look at chat. They're immediately losing it. Yeah. If the web was a thing that was static HTML pages being rendered to 1 to 3 browsers on computers with roughly the same resolution and aspect ratio, sure. But in a modern world, no. Funny enough, I don't like mix-ins much, but I like most of these things. Data types were rough. The module thing, you haven't worked in a big code base. Dan, I'm getting off the train at the nesting stop. Yep. Let's see their complaints about nested CSS, because this is a bit rough. Nested CSS obscures complexity. I hate this feature so much. I hate it more that it's now native to CSS because not only has it spread, but it's mutated, and not in a good Ninja Turtle-y way. Nesting obscures complexity and then makes it impossible to find or fix. Interesting. Let's see what they have to say. Without using a compiler or psychedelic of any kind, can you tell me what this generates? Okay. So feature has color blue, and if it's feature header, then we have a sub tag P underneath, and then there's an A tag underneath that, and it's being hovered and focused, then the color is red. Am I right? Feature, color blue, feature header, that's a new class. And we also want to select links on hover. Oh, it's both. The and here is both. That makes sense. Okay, so if it's a paragraph tag or it's a link tag, and it's being hovered and focused, then we want the color to be red. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't think that's that bad. The nesting making it unclear that this P and A are the same level. This is not that bad at all. He's also intentionally making it complex, which makes it even funnier. But yeah, they're not at the same level. P feature, A focus. Interesting. Yeah. So if it's, oh, never mind. I read this wrong. I read the output wrong. Funny, if I was going to say the output is easier to read, no, this was easier to read. I correctly understood the behavior here, and I didn't here. So inside of a P tag, we have an A tag. And this P tag has to be inside of feature __ header. And then if we hover or focus, the color will be red. So the comma here is because P feature header, hover, or P feature header, focus, both trigger red. That was what I thought it was originally. And the feature header has to be inside the P tag. That's dumb. Why? Okay, that's kind of dumb. Yeah, both of these are confusing for no reason. I missed the fact that this P is being hoisted out for some reason. Yeah, they wrote an intentionally confusing nested example. That checks out. This is weird. Yeah, the P should have been pulled outside. It would have made this significantly simpler, but whatever. I'm not a Ritalin guy, but I get your point, author. It's being prepended to the parent nesting context. That's dumb. Yeah, I've never seen this behavior actually being written before. So it's being hoisted because and is after P instead of before. That's dumb. Nesting is not good. It hides the specificity that you're producing, and it will lend to increasingly fragile code as you try to override a 13-part selector. It was useful for clumping pseudo selectors and pseudo elements, and after that, it is out of hand, making code that is harder and harder to read and even find in your code base. So, more hot takes from me. Do you know what problem I haven't had since I started using Tailwind? Finding where a style came from. Everybody likes to say that they hate reading the DOM with Tailwind. And like, sure, if we go to pic.ping and we take a look at the elements here, this markup is not particularly expressive. I have two main tags. That's funny. That's a copy paste that I fucked up. But none of these describe what the element is. They describe what it does. If I have an element that's not behaving right, like I have this go to images, there's enough space below it. If I want to go find this, I find this element, I copy the class name. Oh, look, there it is. It's actually quite easy to find the thing you're looking for with Tailwind because it first off describes what it does. So I can look here and say, oh, it's missing this thing. I should add this additional class that's missing. It doesn't have some weird styles being applied from somewhere else because it all makes sense. So yes, if you have a bunch of weird, obscure syntax that isn't being included in the bundle, because like this doesn't make it to the client, this doesn't make it to the user. So figuring out where this came from in the browser, that sucks. And if it's your job to join in this massive existing code base where half the engineers who worked on it have already quit, and now you want to quickly find where this is coming from, that sucks. The backwards moving from here to here when debugging a production deployment is not fun. Just interesting, because Tailwind solves so many of the problems that he's discussing here, both the ones that he doesn't think are real and the ones that he's complaining about. So yeah, interpolation et al. This was also just a bad idea that we couldn't have predicted at the time. I'm not mad at the SaaS people for this. Hindsight's 20/20 and all. But what I want is for it all to stop. This is a fundamentally bad thing. Sizes. Ooh, yeah. Yeah, I never loved this syntax. I never liked the idea of like generating a bunch of dynamic classes based on like an array or a set of values. Did we ever even do this in the Twitch code base, man? Like, I don't think I've ever seen someone doing this in the Twitch code base. Maybe a little bit in Core UI, but I've never actually seen people adopting this. Just not a pattern I've seen a lot of. Again, let the loops happen in your JavaScript code. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but Frank, it saves me on keystrokes. Now I can generate more classes and class names just based on that list of sizes. Control-C, you're making all the Tailwind arguments. This author, Frank Taylor here, is going to be the most based Tailwind advocate ever if he just gives it a shot. Like so many of these problems are solved beautifully with Tailwind. The reason you do this is because you had to make the icon class yourself. What if crazy thought, Tailwind already had size baked in. So if I want these helper classes that are useful, awesome. I use them in Tailwind. And now what's even better is if I see something that's size 32 and it shouldn't be, I can search size 32 across my code base and something actually comes up. That's where I'll agree hard here, especially with the finding in your code base thing. If icon size isn't behaving right and I want to find it, I can't find the CSS defining it. So I agree, this is terrible. I don't think many people use it. And I think it's a great argument for Tailwind because we can get the best of both. Okay, here's an example of a place where I'm reusing things. See that these two buttons have the same classes? What if I want to change both? Easy. Select them, Command D. Now I can change both. If I want to make the text bigger, text XL. Now I'm changing them both. If I didn't have a hotkey in my editor to edit the same text in multiple places, Tailwind would be unusable. But the fact that I do makes Tailwind not only usable, but quite a pleasant experience. And repeating the code is not the biggest deal in the world. It actually makes it a lot easier to go from your DOM and the thing you're debugging to the code, the actual place that the thing's happening. And the obvious question has already been asked, what if they're in different files? There's this really cool thing that exists in basically every framework with different files. It's called components. So if you have a thing that you want to have behave exactly the same in multiple places, make it a component. And now you only have to change it in one place. Really nice. Why would I repeat rather than make it a map or make the button a component? Because before there was just one button, and then I wanted two buttons. So I copy pasted and made a second button, which is totally fine. And you know what? If I need a third button, you know what I'd do? Copy paste and make a third button. The alternative is naming things, making data structures, and making finding these components a little bit harder for the next person. If I don't have a reason to separate out these things, then I don't. And generally, I try to reserve map for when I have various sources of data that are not necessarily static and specific to the user. Like a pattern I've seen a lot is, I just saw this when I was overhauling the homepage, const navigation links equals array, where we have href, label images, this. I've seen this pattern a bunch, and then people will map against all these. Why? Unnecessary, waste of time. I see people already saying dry. Yeah, dry is way overrated. Don't rush to abstract those things until they're harder to maintain if you don't. But right now, this file is roughly as simple as it can be because it doesn't need to be more complex. It's just two buttons, who cares? But this is also the issue with CSS, is if I had this with real CSS, I have to have another file now just for the styles for it. Obnoxious. And yes, the reusing styles doc from Tailwind is awesome. And in here, they actually tell you about things like Command D for selecting multiple elements and changing them all at once. They recommend using loops in places where it makes sense. They also, of course, recommend components where it makes sense. Yeah, all valid options. Do what makes sense for you. So yes, actually, in this point, I kind of agree. I think this is a bad pattern. I'm thankful I haven't seen it too much. I think loops and iteration and having access to all these values is important, but so is being able to find the code once you've written it and you're looking at the website. For all of those reasons, I think Tailwind is actually a great option. Are you a VS Code user? Even easier. Highlight it and press Alt Option plus Shift plus down, which will copy the chunk or lines down. Then highlight the part that's repeated a few times when you interpolate and press Command D. Oh, look at that. We actually fully agree. They're using the exact same example. Looks like I pre-read. What did you save? Time and sanity in looking up the SAS syntax? Future times where future you is trying to figure out what the fuck icon 80 pics is living? XKCD is not on your side. Yeah, I love this, by the way. How often do you do the thing? How much time are you shaving? This is whether or not it's worth it based on how much time can it take you for that to have been worth it. So if you do something that takes 1 second every year and you automate that, so you shave the second off for something you do once a year. Yeah. This is also across 5 years. So you save 5 seconds over 5 years if you shave 1 second off a yearly thing. But if you do it every week and you shave 5 minutes, then you just save 21 hours. But if it takes an hour to do, shave 10 days. Yeah. Great diagram. I do think about this one quite a bit. I should reference that more. I actually quite agree with this point. It's nice because I was starting to lose faith in this author, but they're winning me back here. Years ago, I thought it was a great idea to create a mixin for CSS preprocessors to do my BEM stuff. It's not. It removes traceability, which experience has taught me matters more than saved keystrokes. Can we please stop using languages and tech stacks to solve problems that our IDEs are capable of helping us with? Yes. Yes. This is the most I've been aligned with you so far, Frank. Thank you. I absolutely agree. If your IDE can handle this thing, we should not be inventing new technologies to do it instead. I feel the same way about pre-commit hooks. And you know what? I bet this author doesn't like pre-commit hooks for the same reasons. I would hope so. I consider it a contradiction if they don't, but anyways. Seriously, forget the frameworks. Oh boy. I was blown away when Angular came out. It was an actual thing that could do it all. It could render the markup with fun logic-y attributes, respond to data changes, make the AJAX requests, all amazing. Wanted to use Angular for all the interactive web apps. Then React came out. That was amazing. It could render the markup and incoherent mumblings, components or something. And wait, that wasn't even markup? It was JSX. Sure, I had to add a few libraries to really use it, but yay, I used it for interactive web apps. I don't like the implication here. How would you have built an interactive web app without using other libraries before? Would you have written all of the logic yourself before we even had async await? How would you deal with sharing state across multiple nodes? And how would you deal with different pages loading and destroying your current state? How would you deal with submitting a form, nuking the page? If you dealt with every single one of those things yourself, awesome. But I don't believe you. I just don't. Then there was Vue, then Preact, then Ember, Svelte, Backbone, Alpine, Mithril, Solid, Lit, Stencil, Quick. This is not in order at all. But yeah, Ember came kind of before React, honestly, in terms of its adoption. Yeah. It's a weird list, weird history. Anyways, maybe it's because Angular was no one's first choice, even though it came first. Maybe that's why the front-end world lost its damn mind with React. React was so much not like Angular that front-end folks were like, let's use it client-side, server-side, native-side, and the 3 other sides of a damn cube. Folks decided it was a good idea to Reactify all the things. Do you know who else thought this? Apple. Because the magic of React wasn't just React is great. A lot of the magic of React is that the component model is really, really powerful. So here we have some Swift UI code. We have a struct myView, which has a body, some view, which has a vstack, which has the child of text that has a foreground of blue. And the vstack has a frame with these properties and has a background color white. This is React components. The difference is, instead of having JSX syntax where the props come first and the child comes after, it's inverse, where you have the thing that is the element, you pass it the children, and then you append the properties as these dot syntax things after. This concept may have had parts that existed before React, but React's impact is impossible to ignore. React popularized the idea of a component that can own its concerns. It owns the logic, the styles, and the markup all in one box. And that pattern has turned out to be really, really, really good because it lets you have a code base with lots of people working on lots of different features and things without stepping on each other's toes because our pieces live in these boxes that are composable and also self-describing. It's really, really good. And I think there's a reason the whole ecosystem has moved in the direction of React. In fact, everything here that came after React ended up largely copying it. Alpine being an exception here. But Solid was, wow, I like React's composability in JSX. How fast can I make it? Lit was, oh shit, components are so powerful, we should make them a web standard. We should build a framework around it. Quick was, funny enough, Quick is by the creator of Angular. And he made a framework that looks a lot more like React than Angular because he realized React was right about a lot of these things. It's really composable, really dynamic, really powerful, and so flexible. It's a good thing. And React on the server is, again, to address one of the complaints you had before. I'm going to cite you against you now because it's the easiest way to make my point. Remember this .NET MVC app that you discussed earlier where you were using Vue to template things and then you had to write custom jQuery to actually make it interactive after? What if Vue was built in such a way that you could render it on the server and then update it on the client? Thankfully, it is now, but the benefit of putting things like Vue and React on the server is that you solve the 2 layers problem you discussed here. If I need to write a dynamic application, but I want HTML that means something coming from the server, that's the magic of SSR, is you're getting the best of both there. You're getting the benefit of real HTML going to the user, and you're getting the benefit of the dynamic behaviors possible through these frameworks being written in a much more composable way. So it's not like we're using React on the server instead of PHP for our JSON stuff, although React Nil might want a word. I'm not endorsing React Nil. I don't even think the people who made it would either. The goal of React Nil was to make it so you could write logic on the backend using useEffect, useMemo, all of those asynchronous orchestration things without actually rendering React components. So it's like React without a render, which is silly, but no one actually uses this. I think it's the least popular Poimanders project. Yeah, it's 700 something stars. This basically doesn't exist and it's mostly a meme. So we're using React on the server, not because we think we should have React solve the server problem, but because we think having good HTML going to our users is a good thing. And Angular didn't solve that problem. In fact, if you tried to use Angular the same way you described that .NET stack before, you would have been in actual hell. And that's how React, a framework used to deliver interactive content to a whole 28% of the world's population, is being used to generate static sites. That's not the leap I would have made here, but also, as I mentioned before, JSX, the syntax that React popularized, is now being used to make one of the best modern frameworks that solves all the problems that you're bringing up here, to the point where you didn't put it in this list because Angular doesn't run code on the client. So if you do want a properly static site, and you want the benefits of these ecosystems, you have Astro right there. So I agree, React being the default for people to make their blogs might not be good, but Astro can only exist because of React popularizing these tools and growing this ecosystem. I used to have a quote on the Astro homepage that was, Astro is the first framework that feels like the benefits of the old static generation stuff without giving up the quality of the tooling and ecosystem of modern tools. There's a reason that experienced devs like myself that have done things the old way still reach for Astro and the ecosystem of JS and Node tools around it when we want to generate a static site, because it's so nice. It's so good. I had a client a few years ago that was a household name. Their front end was written in Gatsby. I will not take ownership of Gatsby. I have been anti-Gatsby since way before it was cool. I tried it for like 2 hours. I was like, why are they stuffing GraphQL in here? This is awful. So yeah, I agree Gatsby sucks, but as an ecosystem, we had to learn that. And if you're defending the place that Drupal came from, you have no right to talk shit. Gatsby's a static site generator that uses React. This globally known brand has probably 50 websites in at least as many languages, but the content was very static. So imagine the horror the front-end dorks felt when they learned that a content author in Bulgaria updating the terms and conditions didn't want the whole ass site rebuilt for every country and language. This is a weird one. Is this author anti-CI/CD? Because that's how this reads to me. This reads like my earlier take that they would hate pre-commit hooks might be wrong, because it sounds like they don't think changes to your code base should result in your code base rebuilding, which is a very weird take. The only way to best faith play this one, if Gatsby is where you're referencing, Gatsby's build times were so fucking atrocious that I can understand this point. But if you're working in anything vaguely competent, then a change to your code base should trigger a fresh build. But as people are saying FTP, like, if your solution to updating a page was FTPing the new page, if you have a difference in the state of your code base from the state of your production, you have now introduced so much complexity to your code base. If there is a way for something to exist on my site that isn't either in my database or in my source code, you have just broken the chain of responsibility into tons of tiny complex pieces that make no sense at all. That's terrifying. One of the best gifts we have gotten from the modern ecosystems around web development is the idea that when you deploy, you do that by merging to main, and the deploy is just a consequence of the merge. Slow build times suck, and if this is about the build time being slow and the terms and conditions change taking too long because the build time is so slow, fine. Find ways to speed that up. Gatsby did a terrible job at this, largely because they wanted to sell a service. Gatsby was trying to sell something that would minimize rebuilds and do the builds really effectively for you. Gatsby sucked. I agree. But I don't think that's a reason to make these points. And I really hope you're not anti-CI. This would have been a non-problem had the web been written in .NET, Java, or fuck me for saying it, PHP or Node. Yeah, instead, if another developer and I are making changes at the same time and we're using .NET or PHP, yeah, you're going to have even worse problems. CI is good. CD is good. I really hope that's not a hot take, but nah. These goobers got high off NPM modules and did shots of JSX in the bathroom at lunchtime. They chose a framework used to deliver interactive content to a significant percentage of the planet for generating non-interactive content on a server. It took them weeks to come up with a solution to the problem they created when they chose a problem as a solution. Yes, I am calling React a problem. I'm calling Angular, Vue, and all of the rest of them a problem. Because unless you have a specific problem of highly interactive data-driven content, you don't need a framework. You don't need a framework to render static content to the end user. Stop creating complex solutions to simple problems. How are you using .NET then? Do you have a pile of HTML files that .NET just serves? You're doing something dynamic if .NET is your server. This is just like full of contradictions and confusing points. I'm not following at this point. And I'm sure, yeah, Astro does not come up. So thus far, my notes to the author are go learn Astro and Tailwind. I think your tune will change a lot because the types of things you're describing should not be built in React. I agree. If you're building a massive static content platform in 50 different languages, fuck React. React is not the solution to that problem. But if your problem is that React is so popular that it's being used by bad developers to do the wrong thing, that's what being popular means. I'm sorry. I promise you there's just as many bad WordPress sites, if not more. Also, more generally, fuck your complexity. Oh boy. This, more than anything, is a rant about complexity. I am mad at how front-end devs create complex solutions to simple problems. I am mad that front-end devs use tools to obscure complexity. I am mad that front-end devs embrace complexity rather than challenge it. Contradiction, anyways. You know what's good about jQuery? Everything. Oh, okay. Okay. I'm sorry. I just felt my soul lift out of my body and observe the absurdity of what I'm doing right now. I just took spiritual damage from that. Whatever emotional damage React has caused him, he has just paid it back to me, to my chat, and to any of y'all watching this poor fucking video. I am so sorry. jQuery took several complex problems, like browsers doing things differently, selecting elements is too complex, changing things on elements is tedious, AJAX requests are a lot, and it provided a simple, intuitive, and readable solution. Remember that thing I said earlier where I could swap a few words and make this a pro Tailwind article? Tailwind took several complex problems, Cascade being dumb, generating classes being hard, finding which generated class is actually in your code base and where, and having consistency across your elements and styles, and naming things. All hard problems that Tailwind solved. You could break down almost anything in this way. I will say this code is relatively readable. The one weird thing here is the AJAX has a success as one of the fields. That feels really weird in terms of like order of events, because the weird thing I can do here is if I copy this code, since this is an object, I can move success to the top before doing the rest. And I don't know about you guys, but I hate that. I also hate that he didn't format this properly. It's one extra space. Cool. So the issue with this, in my opinion, is that the control flow isn't guaranteed. Some devs might put success up here, some might put it down there. You never know where they're going to put it. You don't know what order these things occur in. I actually do like ordered arguments for stuff like this. Like my ideal here would be AJAX and then .then data and do something with it. That would be my preferred way. It's a small thing, just saying that we have actually learned stuff over the last few years, and there are certain patterns that while they look really good if you write the snippet correctly, writing a snippet correctly hasn't really been your thing throughout this article, which is why that one's a little hard for me to be fair to. I would hate Haskell. It's read right to left, bottom to top, except for when it's read left to right, top to bottom. Oof. Say something nice about jQuery? I say a lot of nice things about jQuery. I think jQuery gets more shit than it deserves. A big part of why it gets so much shit is this type of delusional thinking. People who think we haven't improved the web since jQuery. Azrael just said in chat, jQuery absolutely made working with the web exponentially better when it dropped. It might be the single technology that improved the experience of web devs the most of any one technology that's ever come out. Its impact is impossible to ignore, and the fact that it's still being maintained is incredible. The work they put into jQuery 4 to make sure that they can keep advancing the web and advancing the tools without breaking people's apps is insane. jQuery is good, and jQuery made the internet a significantly better place to build for and to work and to experience the user. But it doesn't mean everything was great about it. And as Akadaden said here, jQuery's success is so great that it's basically built into the browsers now. So many of the features from jQuery are now browser features. Cool your jets for a second and think about how wonderfully simple this code is. It handles finding your element in a way that lets you avoid the null checks. It shortens your event binding. It lets you make an AJAX request. It lets you find the element that goes or that the result goes into and plop it there if it's successful. If the problem is user clicks on thing, you get data and show data, that is a beautiful and simple 11-line solution. It did not need NPM modules and a build system. I'm in pain. And sure, maybe you don't need jQuery anymore, and that's fine. Will you need more lines of code to do the same thing? Of course. But even without jQuery, your complexity doesn't grow exponentially like it would if you brought in a framework with its build system, linters, compilers, and 700 megabytes of node modules, some of which inexplicably require some stupid shit like is_odd or is_get_url. So the reason 700 megs isn't because it's using these random packages. Also, is_odd is a joke, as Chad is pointing out. The issue with node modules being massive is because they're bundling native binaries. The problem with node module sizes is that they're not just JavaScript. The Next.js module is massive because it has a bunch of Rust shit in it. So yeah, if you want node modules to be smaller, we should stop writing them in things that aren't JavaScript. This is not an old man shouts at cloud moment where I want the world to go back to jQuery. This is me trying to illustrate how jQuery solved many problems with simplicity, and somehow we seem to have forgotten the value of just being simple. So I have this random project I was working on. I just don't feel like editing a new one. I'm not even going to render this. I'm just going to do an example of a jQuery data button. result.tsx. So yes, this requires a build step. Fuck you, I don't care. We want this button on click to fetch this data and then render the results to a results tag. First off, this kind of sucks because the button and the results tag are now very separated, and it's hard to know if one changes, if the intended behavior exists or not. And we're also not including the markup here at all. This is just the JavaScript that updates the markup. So we're already going to be taking a penalty just because we have to write the markup too. I know, insane, as we were saying. Export function demo. First, we need the data. Since we don't want the data always, we only want it to come in on click, which, by the way, really weird case. Usually you would want the data to be there when the page loads, not when the button is clicked. You'd want the button click to not fetch data, but to post data and then update the page with the results. So I actually hate this example, but that's not what we're here to talk about. What we're here to talk about is replicating this exact behavior. So I have const mutate data equals use mutation, but this now needs some information. It needs a mutation function. Thankfully, it's pretty easy to write. Fetch API results. So I guess this isn't just fetching with get, this because this has data. So this has to be posting implicitly, right? Just making sure. If you're going to talk about how it describes everything and not include the fact that by default this is posting, fuck you. Like, why does this imply that I'm using post and not get? So we have to include that because we don't have dumb defaults with browser standards. Defaults get. Okay, so if the default is get, what happens when I pass data? So where does this go? Is this just part of the header? URL parameter? What the fuck? Users with an S. Cool. Thank you, SuperMaven, for correcting my code for me. Cool. So now we have the data that we get from the API there. Nice. And in the browser console, can I see how it requested that? We can see it did a GET request. So if I was to add data in here, user testing, and then I check network again, press a button. Yeah, it's just appending that as query params. But now, if I change this to method post, will it change? Yeah, it does. So the point I'm trying to make here is there's a really awful implicit behavior in jQuery here, where what data does changes based on if you put method post or not. So in this example, since we're getting API results, what we're actually getting is this. Why? Like, if this was search params or something, I'd be cool with that. But again, jQuery's not perfect. It tried so hard to make things convenient that it's full of really weird behaviors like this. Yeah, this is dumb. So we're going to do this correctly because we want to post with data. So we're actually going to specify method post, and we'll specify the body, JSON.stringify, foobar. Cool. So since we're following actual web standards, I thought that the web platform was good. We should probably use it more, right? Yeah. So now we have the mutating data. And reminder, unlike the jQuery code, we're actually going to include the markup here too. So it's going to look worse, but it looks worse because we're actually like using the results and we're actually rendering things here. If I do data and, we don't know what data is going to be. So we can mutate that. There's a bunch of different places we can do it. Easiest is .then. Ta-da. Now we have an actual web standards following solution here that is a button on click and then loads the data, and we now choose whether or not this element renders. What if we want a different thing to render in results before we have the new content? This is a really good pattern for encapsulating those things. And I think his argument before was the number of lines of code. So I'm going to win this argument by doing the same thing he did here, which is not using post or a body. It's actually doing the following. Foo equals bar. And if I really want to make this as minimal as possible, just to make the point, const mutation function, pass that here. Okay, that doesn't actually help as much as I thought it would. Annoying, but fine. I made the same mistake there. So if the thing we're measuring on is lines of code, his was 11. We'll delete it. Because mine, with white space included and the nice like line break formatting and the markup, mine's 14. Meh. And there's plenty of things I could do here to make it smaller. Like if I don't include the markup, we're just including the behavior part here. We're at 8 lines of code. So while on one hand, I agree that having simple syntax for doing these types of things is important, I think the fact that this code has no direct relationship with the markup sucks. So yes, I left the React query provider out, but he left out importing jQuery, same difference. Yeah, the point I'm trying to make is that the line of code difference here is negligible. The order of events here is unnecessarily flexible, and he left out all of the HTML. So it's actually possible this code doesn't work because there's no results element or there's no get results button. By the way, weren't we talking earlier about good names for classes? Because if we were to do this the way that you were recommending earlier, it would actually be results __ button -- default. And this would be results __ results -- default, I guess, too. Cool. Like, if you really want to play this game, I'll play. I'm down. But personally, I find this both less readable and way less maintainable, even if simply because I can move success up like that. Now I can't read the order of events here at all. The magic of React is how much more readable, and like the benefit of React here is how much more readable and maintainable the result is, because the relationship between these things is contained within this box. So I have this box, demo, and I want it to render this button and then render the results after. But you can read this top to bottom, and that's what I like much more. In this example, not as much so, because this mutation happens asynchronously. But if it was happening when the component was rendered with use query instead, we can just call it there, do the same thing. One last point I want to emphasize here, just to showcase why I think this is important. What if we wanted 2 of this button? What if we wanted 4 of them, and we were going to change foo to A or B or C, etc.? How would we do that with this code? I can tell you, it's not fun. We're going to have to copy paste this code multiple times and change it to results button A, results button B, and results button C. And then we're going to have to go through all of these and change the data it's sending. Could I wrap this as its own function and then pass the value and generate the nice function for that? Ugh. Good luck, have fun. Let's see how I do this in React. Props. And this is with TypeScript, by the way, which I could have just opted out of, but I chose to include it. So props, foo string, change that to a string template. Props.foo. Now we're done. Now if I want 15 of these, all with different foos, demo foo equals A. Demo foo equals B. I think this is awesome. The fact that we have in roughly the same amount of code, the entirety of the markup, the ability to style this here too, the behavior, all race conditions and such handled as well, using the web standard fetch instead of a wrapper around it, and then dynamically rendering or not rendering this element, as well if we want, we can have a loading state too. So if we want to have something that happens during loading, I guess is pending is correct here, because we want to show something when loading, we can do that. Let's say we want to disable the button when this is happening, so we don't want overfiring. Disabled equals is pending. How are you going to do that in here? This is where it falls apart. I think if you just look at this example and don't think about how you integrate it, how you change it, how you maintain it, what happens if you will change the order of things in here, how you deal with that in code review, and you don't think about it beyond this simple example, yeah, it seems like a fair own. But the reality of how code changes over time just fundamentally disagrees. And while this code might be a quick fix when you're quickly working on the problem, especially back in the day where there weren't built-in solutions for any of these things, yes, this is significantly better than writing JavaScript before jQuery existed. But the new patterns solve these problems so much better. This isn't wonderfully simple beyond the problem it's solving. This solution does not scale to more complex problems ever. This solution scales up and down beautifully. That's my issue. Let's continue reading this. Oh, Jesus Christ, there's even more. So much for a 14-minute read. Goddamn. Back to where we were. Pretend I'm not talking about JavaScript for a second. Let's pretend it's just an ordinary, everyday, 3-template website. Maybe it's managed by a CMS. Maybe it's not. Does it really need Tailwind, Bootstrap, even Gasp, class from the back of the room, Sass? Is writing plain CSS really such a terrible thing? No. If you already have a thing that's built and you want to make quick changes to it, absolutely. But if you're architecting a new application and you want to have a good maintainable developer experience, or you're trying to dig something out of fucking hell, yeah, I would want to use some of those things. The issue I see is whenever there's an article like this, the argument is never, I see why these things are popular. They absolutely bring value. I just think they're hurting in these 3 ways. The argument's almost always, this is all bad. It was always simpler before. None of these things made sense. Why are you doing it? And I hate that angle. Let me fill you in on a cool fact about CSS. It doesn't need a fucking compiler. No npm install -d sass, no npm I gulp. You get to tell Webpack to fuck off, good and proper, like the way the good Lord intended. So they are a no build person. I had a feeling as we were going through this, but yeah, good luck, have fun. This is a great take if you don't have a big code base, to be fair. There's a horseshoe theory going on here. I'm trying to figure out if I'm on the horseshoeing coming together or if they are, but I hate that point. Oh, and enough with the new and shiny. Finally, something we can agree on. As I brought up at the beginning here, I think that devs reach for new things far too often. And you should probably use things that are older most of the time, unless you're really excited about the new thing. Yeah, but React is not new and shiny anymore. Let's be real. Ugh. Sure, it's awesome that you can strongly type CSS variables, but that doesn't mean you should. Can you have web components with declarative shadow DOM? Duh. But hear me out. Why have 3 steps to render markup when you could have 1? Yeah, I agree with all of this so far. I think web components are bad. Yes, the new JS framework is all the awesomeness. Definitely do a side project with it. Please, in the name of her sweet saint fuck of apathy, don't use it in your next project. Side project versus next project. Yeah. Anyways, we haven't learned what our regrets will be, and the regrets are what everyone else has to live with but you. Yes, this is a fair point. It's also a bias that I have. There's a lot of times where I adopted a thing, and before we started to run into the problem, I had already left. But you're also failing to acknowledge the problems with all of the technologies and things you're recommending, and you're refusing to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the tools that we've discussed in this article are things that we invented to solve very real problems that we had in very real code bases. Yeah. I also agree here. Give it 2 years before you take it for a ride in production. In late 2020, the React team introduced the zero bundle size React server components concept. Okay, so it sounds like server components are 2x past your 2-year point here. So yeah, LOL. Do you know what happens in the next 2 years? 2 years worth of Stack Overflow questions. Yeah. To you watching this video right now, I just had the displeasure of reading this whole section, and I'm not going to put you through that without consent. So if you do want to read whatever the fuck he was saying here, feel free. There's a link in the description, but I'm not going to put you through that. The new and shiny is fun for side projects. It is not for production. Yeah. And I like the rule of put 2 years between you and any new tech. It's sad that you just went on whatever the fuck you're doing here, because I agree with the point of this part. You should absolutely wait a little bit before taking a risky bet on a new piece of technology. And you should acknowledge the fact that it's risky. I have a lot of videos where I talk about this. I have one that bombed, and I've tried rebranding it a bunch of times, and I don't know why this one never does well. Betting on your tech stack. The point of this video, also, I've noticed these videos tend to be about 5 minutes long and they tend to bomb. I should maybe do a longer one. Yeah, don't make gambles on your tech stack. It's almost always a bad idea. Your bet should be the product, not the tech. If you really want to, if you deeply believe in and understand a new piece of technology, awesome. Have fun, but you need to know the risk profile. The risk profile of an established thing is very different from the risk profile of a brand new thing. But the fact that he's talking about React as though it's this brand new thing, when React's been out for over 10 years and server components have been out for over 4, it's a bit weird to me. TLDR, just grow up and think. You know what? I got a spicy take. And this one's even going to own myself a bit. If your response to something that is popular that you don't like is grow up, that's a self-own. If this thing is popular enough that lots of very talented adults aren't just using it, but are explaining it, pushing it, and building incredible things with it, there's basically no way you could say this in this context that isn't a self-own. And it sucks. I was actually really excited to open this article and agree a bunch. And I went out of my way to find things to agree on because I try to look to people who disagree with me and find things I can learn from and potentially agree with. But it seems like you're living in the late 2000s. And I can't help but point out this contradiction that was discovered by chat, that he used the phrase bait assholes, which is the thing I skipped over for y'all, and grow up right below it. My spicy take is maybe these things happen for a reason. Maybe, just maybe, when these things take over and become the norm, like, I don't know, TypeScript or React or Bootstrap or Tailwind or Sass or all these other things, maybe it's not because we're dumb. Maybe it's because there is some value in these things for some people. Crazy thought. I know, it might take an adult to think through that one. But come on, man. The absolute refusal to acknowledge the valid reasons why we might find these things beneficial is just absurd. Like, genuinely absurd to me. I can't believe it levels absurd. Let's go through his TLDR and be done with this one. Think you can care about the content first. Okay, cool. Again, agreements. If you're not thinking about the actual content of the page that you're rendering, you're not doing your job. And I find that to be far too common. Not just with front end, but actually, especially backend devs. I find backend devs are the worst about this, where they want to talk about how many requests per second their backend can handle and not about how it benefits the user. Yeah, I agree with him here. But also, yes, assume the user's interests are more important than your own. We are fully aligned at that point. Quit acting like CSS is some giant ass mistake that needs fixing. It's a medium ass mistake, and there are things that need fixing. A group of people who were collectively smarter than us wrote those specs. If a high enough percentage of your users are using the thing wrong, you can't blame the user anymore. What percentage of CSS devs have to have a problem with CSS before you realize maybe it shouldn't be like this? I promise you that if you took an average dev and had them build something with CSS, and you took an identical average dev and had them build the same thing with Tailwind, you and I both would look at the network profile, the behaviors of the site, and the quality of experience and say, yeah, the one with Tailwind is obviously better. Sometimes tools can steer the users in the right direction. And if the thing we care about in the end is the users, maybe we should be more accepting of tools that might not make us feel as smart, but make it easier for us to write the right thing, regardless of how experienced we are. The beauty of Tailwind is it can take somebody who sucks at CSS and carry them slowly to writing good CSS. Yeah, CSS is not a pit of success. Very well put, Alex. Server-side rendering was not invented with JavaScript, and it doesn't have to be implemented with JavaScript. We discussed this one earlier, but I think the issue here is that the term server-side rendering didn't need to exist until client-side rendering did. And the reason we started to say SSR was to contradict the existing single-page app client-side rendered thing that became popular in the early 2010s. So the server-side rendering concept, I agree, is not unique to JavaScript, but the terminology exists because of JavaScript, period. JavaScript is neither the godsend nor the hellspawn for your project. It's a tool which you can choose to use incorrectly. Learn when JavaScript's the right tool for the job. Yeah, that's fair, and I agree. Quit doing hard things for simple problems. Yes, again, I agree. Quit doing things that are degrees of difficulty harder than the problem. When a problem presents itself, look for multiple solutions, and then choose the simplest one. Assume the simplest solution is the best. Yes. And then quit chasing the new and shiny in your day job. Okay. Yes. So if your thought now is, why the fuck did I turn this article into a video? Generally, when I'm skimming articles to see if it's something that makes sense for content or not, one of the first things I do is scroll to the bottom and get a rough idea of the conclusion. I think I did that here because I wouldn't have put it on the list otherwise. And if I had just read this, I agree with most of it. It was just his intent, his meaning, his points, his examples, and his alternatives that I disagree with. And I wish I had known that before going in because it would have been a very different video. So to Frank Taylor, thank you for writing this. Thank you for putting the effort in. And thank you for working to make the web better. I know your intentions are good, but what a fucking read. Bye, nerds.